looking forward to hearing your thoughts. It's all sort of very in formation right now, but this is something I've been thinking about for quite some time. I haven't had yet the chance to kind of dive deep into it, so I'm looking forward to sharing it and conversing about it afterwards. Um, Thank you to Ishan and to all of you for having me here. I'm sad that this didn't happen when I was in the Midwest because I was pretty close to you guys, but I'm glad that it's happening now virtually anyway. Um, Okay, so I'm gonna start. If I'm looking down, it's because I have my notes all spread out, including my phone, and I'm also gonna try to time myself. So I am interested in sort of style and AI, amongst other things that I'm looking at right now. I'm going to start with some of the visual stuff, and I'm going to bring in text and language. But you guys might have noticed that a couple of years ago, something called Lenza was sort of in the news because a lot of people were using it to have their own selfies sort of be rendered in a different style. And so there were questions of like, surveillance, and is it like collecting our data, or is it like a sinister conspiracy to like have all of our faces mapped, things like that, as if, that we already don't have it. Um, but if you put that in conversation with previous iterations of similar stuff. So this is from 2016, when Prisma, an app, this is long before the present sort of AI boom, long before LLMs, long before diffusion models, had a similar thing where it's like you take a photo and then you make it like cubist or impressionist or like like a painting or a photograph from someone famous, like do it in the style of Van Gogh and so on and so forth. You start seeing like this broader pattern. That is my first point. Even some of the earlier text production stuff was like, hey, look, you can write this in the style of whatever, right? So choosing the style. It also was an important part of a lot of marketing of AI early on, which is to say that it can do things in the style of other things. And so this is, I think, worth itself like thinking about. Um, the other part of it is, the style that comes out of AI. So again, it pains me a lot because I am an over excessive M dash user and have been since I learned how to write English. So it really pains me. But these kind of trends of like, this is how AI writes, like this is the AI's style, is like the other part of the conversation. The one being AI recognizing and doing things in styles that exist in the world, and the other is AI producing styles that then start existing in the world, right? So should AI influence our writing style? So my starting point here is simply the fact that we are endlessly fascinated with and are using style as a concept. By we, I generally hear mean multiple groups of people, including sort of the users of contemporary AI technologies, the sort of common customers, but also tech companies, researchers who work at the edge of AI. Style is an important thing for talking about AI. So that's just my kind of starting jumping point, right? Then, and this is where I'm gonna spend more of my time today, I mean to ask, what are we talking about when we talk about style in AI, right? So the title that I had was like, what is style for AI? Now we can ask what style is for humans, and I think it's a question I'll also address in a second. But what is style for AI? Is it the same thing? If it is, how does that change questions and understandings of style today for us? And if it's not, why not? What's happening? So what I'm going to talk about today is basically what happened to style. I've already kind of spoken about the discursive call to sort of think about style, the fact that this is not just coming because, I want to talk about it, but because I think there's a pattern here that's a much longer standing pattern than just even AI, that is talking about style as an important part of conversations around sort of visual and linguistic technologies today. I'm going to briefly talk about sort of like style and its use historically. And then I'm going to sort of hypothesize and talk briefly about what different concepts of styles look like and why it might be useful to like think of AI in a certain way within this trajectory. So for those of you who might remember, Fred Jameson actually around where he first talks about the role of architecture in spatializing what are otherwise kind of complex problems in postmodernism. He notes in, and this is again, going back to, he's been writing about it since between 83 and 91. In 91, he publishes this kind of final version of that sentence, which is to say that postmodernism is bringing about an end of the style. What he means there is that the individual, unique, personal, distinctive style is on its way out, he says. Instead, uh, he says that what has happened is that the norm itself has become eclipsed. It's been reduced to neutral speech, and it becomes one more idiolect amongst many. So, it's kind of the formulation that I've always found to be quite useful is that modernist styles become postmodernist codes. So, end of style for him is not just end of style, is it? Because codes begin, right? So, what does that mean for us in terms of like culturally speaking? It quite simply means that individual style categories sort of take a downturn, and instead, what starts rising is codes, is formulated systems of semiotics in culture, right? So, I mean, you can think about it in the same term as code as law, right? So, building codes and fire codes, which is to say, an internally consistent system that works a certain way. And so you have a plethora of codes that you can draw from and combine, but that nevertheless do not individually reflect style as it used to be in the sort of high modernist era. Now, there's a lot of work, as you might imagine, on style uh, across disciplines. Architecture, art history, visual culture and theory, literature, architecture, style. As a categorization has been sort of like really thought about a lot, and a lot has been done with style, so to say. um, and I think it's worth sort of interfacing that with what I'm talking about is happening today. So again, I'm not going to go into detail, but just to give you a brief idea that even amongst all of these are drawn from this book, The Concept of Style, on the left, which is a kind of back in the day when there used to be like NEA and NEH funding, like a bunch of people, I think this was 70s, like top scholars on style in different fields, in art, literature, visual culture, science, got together to like have a summer long conversation in like Colorado or wherever. And they kind of came up with what for that time was kind of like the defining state of like here are all the ways in which different communities understand style and why like what it means for them and how they may be like talking across each other in some cases, or maybe referencing or disagreeing with each other in some cases, right? So for some style is content, for some it's like a formal thing, for others it's not form itself but it's relationship, for others it's a relationship between form and content, for others those are really bad categories to describe style. There are different ways in which scholars across different fields have understood style, is all I'm gonna trying to say, right? So for some it's like a static thing, like you can see a style or notify a style and then that's it. But for others it's like an ever-changing category, that style, when you sort of make it constant, already sort of stops being style. And so again, multiple ways of understanding it. Um, what I want to sort of do, and what I've been thinking about, is putting all of that in conversation with style as it exists in the technical discourse on AI. And the reason I do that is quite simple, is because I think that one particular element for thinking about, you know, culture or art, that we often overlook is cultural and aesthetic and creative sensibilities of the people who have a sort of dominant hegemony, or who have more power than others in how conversations go, or in literal how like material resources flow, right? Which is to say that one of my approaches a lot has always been to think really strongly about the culture of a technical community as the culture that is being studied, right? So the multiple cultures, of course, there's multiple cultures in the world, but there's also like these like microcultures, right? And this is kind of something, again, Jameson also says about like how offices have their own sort of like code. You know, might be interested. Some of you might already be well aware of like even things such as the fact that at some point of time, coding became a masculine profession from a feminine one. So a lot of like cultural things internally to a community needed to happen for what was essentially a feminine sort of like feminized profession to become masculine. um, you know, Nathan and Smenger has a wonderful book, um, and it's kind of worth asking, as he does, and then he details how that happened, how like the action of like sitting on a computer in an air conditioned office, getting paid half decent, um, became like a masculine action. Like there was very little in of itself that should have been the case. But then that is reflexive of cultural shifts within a community, right? And so style, as it's being used in technical operations, in technical papers, in memos, in the substacks they write, and so on and so forth. And I mean, they're also, you can say, different kinds of technical worlds, is what sort of like I am after, and how to kind of interface that with this longer standing notion of style that we get from humanities and arts. So, what is style? Is style a first or a second order operation? How does style work? The easiest way to kind of start understanding this is to look at what is style transfer. So before we had contemporary diffusion models, we had style transfer techniques. In fact, one of the things that I was trying to point out here, with between Lensa and Prisma, is that even though Lensa is an AI app after the rise of diffusion models, and Prisma is not. Prisma just used what back then were called style transfer techniques. There is a genealogy here that this is based on the previous one that I think is kind of very important. And that's why style transfer techniques become my first sort of like location for this analysis. And so style transfer techniques basically do a lot of things. But essentially, the easiest way to understand like early forms of this, which then later was tagged as an AI, but initially wasn't marketed as such, was the fact that you were superimposing two images. So you take an image, like your selfie, a photograph you've taken, and then you superimpose like a Van Gogh or something on it in some way. You decrease the opacity and increase the texture or whatever it is that you do. So very basic superimposition was like the first fundamental step towards style transfer. That's what was happening with something like Prisma, for example. But even in Prisma, you started getting, and like apps around that time, you started getting sort of, style as being identified by convolutional neural networks. So I'm not going to go into kind of technical details, but I think one of the kind of hypotheses that I'm kind of running with here is if for some technical kind of abstraction, style is the correlation between different filter channels of CNN, and that's kind of true in some cases. Um, so what you then have basically is that you either recognize or produce an image in multi-layer networks, and because the weights of these layers are in relation with each other, that relation is what you're looking at as style, not necessarily this or that layer, right? So layers usually are features. Again, these things change, so not making generalized statements because there's a lot happening in different parts of this research. But nevertheless, when computer scientists say style, as they do, like there's ample work where computer scientists themselves use the word style. When they say style, what they sometimes mean is like correlations between the responses of different filter channels in the layers. Um, okay, so style itself as it developed in artificial intelligence, um, you might be surprised or not to know that it actually kind of goes back at least to the 90s, if not earlier. So in mid 90s, you start getting like texture synthesis for texture modeling. So a very famous example of all this kind of textural stuff is something like Perlin noise, right? So which, wins an Oscar as like an important uh, way of like making our images and our renders look sort of quote unquote realistic, which is to like give them texture, because in real life nothing is plain 3D as surfaces often are in 3D rendering. And so some of the earlier textural stuff, like different kinds of textures, were the predecessors on which you started getting sort of like image style transfer techniques. Um, by mid 2015, so you see a big gap here in like sort of canonical work within computer science between image quilting and artistic style in 2015. And so this basically, which is to say, nobody's thinking about style, they're not even calling it style. So again, if you note from 95 to 2001, the word style really doesn't appear, right? They're talking about synthesized textures primarily. Texture and texture synthesis is the term that's being used there. So when that work starts being called style, and this is my sort of argument here, you start getting first the style transfer techniques, and then the style transfer techniques themselves start being called AI. Which is not to say that there is no AI there, right? These are AI technologies, but like, what are they based off on? Like, what is their understanding of the world? Like, if I develop an AI technology today, whatever it may look like, what is its understanding of the world? Like, what are the things in the world that I'm pulling from? A lot of my work does this kind of move, which is to say, I think that you understand what something really does is by asking before you have the words for what it is doing it is, right? So, which is my simple sort of methodological principle that I follow across my work is to say that before the moment where the vocabulary for a technology is completely sort of like made, there's a moment where you're borrowing things from the world. Like you're trying to see if this word works, or if this concept works, or if this analogy works. And at that moment, it's usually more enlightening and illuminating than what technology starts doing afterwards. Because at that point, you kind of get to see what about culture, sociology, like the social systems, politics, economy is sort of like going into, so to say, right? The machine production machine. In any case, my point here is that you see a clear pattern where somewhere in mid 2010s, a thing that used to be called texture modeling and texture synthesis started being called style. And uh, you then start almost having style and neural networks, because back then we were not even calling it AI that much. We were first calling them like very specific technical terms because it was coming from kind of the studies of neural networks. Then we started calling them machine learning, and then came AI. But each of these like changes is not sort of like happens. Like I think there's a weight to what we call things, and I think it's kind of important to know. And there's a lot there sort of that goes on. But in this particular case, what I'm trying to point out is that somewhere around 2015, style appeared for the first time in computer science. Period. And it appeared in computer science as almost kind of now related to neural networks, which then go on to become AI. So AI and style, even though today we might see it as like the thing, I mean, if we were talking about this right when ChatGPT was being launched, you would know what I mean. Some of the first like demonstrations of it was like, this can do something in the style of that. So there's like a kind of fundamental rhetorical principle there of like, it can embody multiple styles that is coming from this genealogy, a genealogy that has this notable break in around 2015, where it starts being called style. Okay, so again, we can talk about style in terms of literary stuff, not just visual. And there is more to discuss here technically about how styles are identified and replicated and what style means. But as I said, like one of my fundamental sort of hypotheses here is that when you start calling a new thing style, you may actually have a logical reason to test out, like of all the sort of like old legendary scholars who collected in 1970s in Colorado, because NEH had a lot of money back then, um, who was right and who was wrong. Like if they agree that this is also style, then actually now you may have a test case for like figuring out what style was or is, even for a different discipline. Or if not, then you can actually have like an understanding of what this same thing means for AI. Like what does it mean? Um, so I again will not go into details on like all the sort of work that's been happening more recently. So I think a lot of scholars have been looking at style in AI even today. This is an example from literature where style for them appeared across multiple works as being the kind of middle ground around which things are written, right? So in some ways, style as the middle between form and content. Um, so all the conversations about sort of like latent spaces and embeddings all already have a sort of like an implicit theory of style in today's kind of day and age. And I think it's kind of worth following that. So what am I trying to say? Well, I think what I'm trying to understand here is that firstly, what is style for AI discourse, right? I find things that it's not. Style is not clustering specifically. Style is can be understood as not content, right? Even though earlier versions of it were superimpositions. Style, because it's coming from superimpositions, is much more easier to collage and recombine. almost in the kind of like codical sense that that Jameson was writing about with the rise of postmodernism. It's kind of like producing like these new definitions and codes, and it's showing up as a property, right? So one way to go back to the debates is that for most of the time between 1950s and 1990s, most experts uh, saw style to be a taxonomic thing, right? No, everything doesn't have style. It's that when I look at 100 things, I divide them and I see patterns, and that pattern is the style. It's not because each thing has that style in it. It's like a taxonomy that I'm offering, right? It's a categorization, it's a clustering I'm offering. It's not a property. But what we do see post 2015 in computer science is that it's absolutely a property. Nothing can have no style in diffusion models, and sort of, well, more specifically in convolutional neural networks, nothing cannot have a style, which is kind of antithetical to how we understand style in art and aesthetics and like in creative production, right? Like um yeah, of course, like some buildings would be like incredibly generic and so they wouldn't have a style, like um whereas that's not the case for the technical implementation of style. So style, to kind of go back etymologically, um, goes to sort of, it comes from like stylus in Latin, it became stylos in Greek. And I think it indicates a kind of like infusion of structure into individual expression. So if you train someone a certain way, they will start producing something in that style. So individual expression is technically unbounded. Like, a baby can be weird in infinite number of ways, but over time they start getting structures, and so there's a style is kind of like infusion of that structure into individual expression, etymologically speaking. Um, this is not that distinct from the question of lifestyle, which has again been there with the studies of style right from the beginning. The fact that style for some experts, such as Mary Povey, is itself an ideology, right? So the style appears as she says, it's a lived experience of cultural values. So you start understanding style somewhere around 80s for the first time as like lifestyle. Like this is their lifestyle, this is their lifestyle. Um, I want to argue that, like in AI, in computer science, style is closer to the collective style, to sartorial style. Um, it's always clustered, but doesn't definitionally need to be clusters. It is easier to embed in space. Um, and it's about kind of breakdown, right? So going to, like, I don't know, Deleuze or something, the fact that all of us have several individualities that are then kind of joined in all these different ways is not that unlike how style is being treated when AI uh, you know understands or talks about style. um, so I argue that kind of style in AI is a kind of extractive node of re or degeneration. It's kind of the superposition that is extractive. Like everything needs to have a style, so you will extract one by the virtue of a technical operation. You cannot, the answer cannot be no style, or like this is bland, right? Or this is generic. The answer has to be, well, if it is generic, that then genre is the style. Like every genericity needs to be stylized and sort of then be open for reinterpretation. Again, not gonna go into details, but I think there's a whole thing about how, like, uh, even the way we talk about things kind of comes back in language modeling as sort of like a discursive style. Anyway, I'm gonna stop there. But the thing that I primarily wanted to kind of get at is the following: that style for an AI is not the same thing as style for humans, pre-AI. Um, if it feels like that way today, it's only because we've sort of like, gotten used to accepting this definition of style versus what used to be the common definition of style pre-2015, which raises questions about how concepts move, and when do we accept concepts that are coming from a specific uh, sort of zone, specific discursive zone. Number two, so number one was the style for an AI is not the same thing as style for a human, right? Number two, uh, style for AI is basically an outgrowth of a branding problem. So pre 2015, the image editing apps were not being deemed creative enough. And I don't have it here, but somehow I've been working more on it. And I see all these instances where like 2012, 2013, 2014, it's like there are all these apps, much like Prisma, they are on the market, but because they're not using the language of style, they are not being classified as creative. They're being classified as like, cursory experiments that nobody wants to do. But the moment you start employing sort of like creative vocabulary that comes from, arts and culture and crafts, you basically start addressing a different marketing need. And as a result, calling that thing, instead of calling it like, texture synthesis, which is where it was coming from, you start calling it style. And so basically, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes, even though retroactively, like right now, it's like, yeah, of course, I mean, sure, that is style transfer, isn't it? And yes, that is, but it wasn't at that point of time. And so what that then means is that we have to be sort of like really careful about importing vocabularies that basically reflect something else. And not give up without a fight what creative vocabularies and terms mean by showing this distinction between what for an AI is style and what for humans, and what for much of our public culture has been style. What I'm trying to essentially get at is the fact that there's a value ladenness to borrowing conceptual categories that are given to us by technical discourses, because not because technical discourses shouldn't have their own sort of agency in changing words and concepts, but primarily because in this case, these are economic decisions as well. So if all of us start thinking about something else as style because it's a marketing decision somewhere else, then we have to be more careful. If it was just a question of like, yeah, the physicists call it red and the biologists call it green, then sure, who cares? But if it's a question of we have given the sort of like terms that were in the expertise zone of a certain group and we have given it over to a different expertise zone, then we are getting into the territory of not being careful, right? And I mean this in a more general way as well. So to kind of conclude, what I want to kind of offer more generally is to say, when we hear a term that we otherwise know, a concept category that we otherwise are familiar with, and we hear in the context of AI, because of the outsized discursive and marketing influence these sort of companies have as a financial unit, we should ask ourselves, is X for AI the same thing as X for me? So some of my future work that I'm doing right now is on the question of interpretation and explanation, right? So if you say I'm working towards explainable AI, um, are we talking about explanation the same way as I would talk about it as an expert in rhetoric, for example? Are we talking about interpretation the same way? Nevertheless, that to me is the kind of horizon of asking the question, what to AI is X? Because the X is all around us, and the AI is all around us. So you might as well figure out what is inherently or not a conceptual category that we have to borrow. Um, well, thank you so much, and looking forward to chatting. I
I
can't
can't
hear
hear
you.
you. You can hear me now. Can you
Yeah,
hear?
now I can hear
You
you.
can hear me now. Thank you. That was great. I mean, it's fascinating how you like sort of packed or unpacked the history of these micro technical systems and maybe even like an ontology of these words and how they connected to the history of the technology that they're tied to. So the how does the word the where does the word come from and where does the technology come from, and sort of the meeting points between that. And I'm just thinking there's like there's probably I'm thinking through every word I've used while describing technology or while using technology. I'm like, oh, there's probably like I don't know, this vast history behind each one of those words. So this was just like going through the idea of style, where it comes from, how they also chart different paths between humans versus AI versus maybe algorithms is
Yeah.
a different direction. So
Yeah.
I don't know, that was really informative. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Ranjot some questions, but if anyone has questions on in the room, just raise your hand and let me know. Ryan, you have a question? Yeah, you want to come in and ask first? Yeah, why don't you start us off? Um,
Hi, Ranjodh. Thanks for the talk. I have like a rough definition of style that I'd like to get your thoughts on. Um, so, style as a material representation or evidence of the way in which networks of information are navigated, filtered, processed, and then rearticulated or expressed back into the world. Um, I can repeat that if you want. And how do you think that statement varies for like a computer or so-called AI versus humans at this point?
Hmm. Yeah. I like
oh,
how
wait, sorry, Ranjot.
textural
Give me one
that.
second. We can't hear you. Um, we're having our own technical uh, difficulties over here.
Can you
Now we
hear
can.
me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Um, yeah, thanks for that. I quite like the kind of multi-layered textural sort of tendency that you bring in how you phrase that. Um, could you say that again? Because
Yeah.
I
So
have some parts of it in my head more than the others.
like a material representation or evidence of the way in which networks of information are navigated, filtered, processed, and then rearticulated or expressed.
Yeah. Um, so I think, for example, so I have a very I was a computer scientist before I came into the humanities and the arts, and I have like a case of the science brain. And often when what that usually basically means is that I treat things as experiments and as like, negative results, and like how do you falsify this or how not, and so on and so forth. So in this case, for example, uh, firstly, I mean, let's look at the features of the definition you put forward, right? Uh, the word information, or the word networks. Um, if style is to be correlated with information, then it has to be only maximum 60 to 70 years old, no more. If it has to be correlated with networks, it can go back to 250, 300 years old, because that's when we first get the network imaginary, what you would call it. So trained nets are the first nets, and then neural net come in, but they are neural nets in the sense of like neuroscience, not in the sense of artificial neural networks, right? Information comes in much later. Representation has a different history. Uh, Material representation uh, takes representation into a completely different direction, because for most people in the arts, style would be the immaterial part, right? So sometimes, again, this comes down to like the form and content and where you fall on it. But it's entirely possible that actually style for several communities might not be material, right? So it is the thing that the moment you pin down, it escapes. So, which is a very brief way of saying that I think what you outline is really great, and I would have to like further fine tune it to say that we probably should be careful with, yeah, like I would think that that maybe is something that a network scientist thinking about AI might call style, but not a data scientist, and not a machine vision expert, and not a computational linguist. Because for all of them, the parameters of what material representation looks like, or filtering and processing looks like, and how to define that will not look the same. But for a network scientist, I think it will be perhaps the closest to what you've said. Now, the second question then would be to kind of like tabulate this and say, okay, but like if you two guys, y'all disagree about it, can we at least come up with like a working definition that's useful for us, like even if you have disagreements about it? And that's a part of what I'm trying to say here, is that I think you can by cluster find a working definition from computer sciences more broadly, and that has some internal consistencies, and it might even look very close to what you are saying. I think there's a lot there that's very useful, but I would still maintain that there's like a massive gulf between that and how publicly and creatively we have understood the term in years past. And that gap to me is why I think we need to sort of like think about this strongly and say, is style the same thing to an AI as it is to a human? And the answer for me directly is that it's not. It's a different thing. And actually, perhaps maybe we're doing it a disservice by calling it style. Maybe it's capturing something else that we don't existingly previously had a vocabulary for. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think style itself had like 40 definitions, and so it's a patchwork of some of those, but not intentionally. It's not because they were inspired by how architects or art historians were talking about style. It just happened because that is technically how the implementation ended up happening, given the technical genealogies from texture synthesis. And so now this ends up getting called style. But that's besides the point. That's not a point of direct genealogies. That's a point of like, who's going to buy this? Like, if I call this thing that, who's going to buy it? And that always kind of, I think, drives these definitional problems that appear on the other end. Sorry, that's a long rant,
Oh, that's
but I,
okay. So,
but I hope I answered your question in some ways.
yeah, so there's this massive divide between the actual sciences and the humanities that poses like a intense difficulty in actually like agreeing on what to name things, more or less.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and goes back to the kind of two cultural stuff. But I think so. One of my disciplinary trainings is in the field of science and technology studies, which again many in the room might know is itself like a sort of a meta disciplinary orientation between historians, philosophers, anthropologists, sociologists, cultural theorists, et cetera, of science and technologies, right? So everyone in humanities and social sciences working on understanding how science works or how technology works. But what I'm trying to say is that I think one of the things that we learn from doing that work, from looking at other communities, like you would look at other cultures, is that there may be broader differences, but those broader differences usually break down if you don't sustain them. And so you need to do a lot of work to keep the differences clear, right? So I'll take an example from a completely different thing. Um, my friend and co-author Lucy Suchman looked at how neuroscientists and computer scientists talk about neural networks. And one of the things that she found out, because there were two distinguished professors at University of Toronto, a neuroscientist and a computer scientist, the computer scientist being Jeff Hinton, the Nobel winner, and the neuroscientist being Gillian Einstein, a really sort of famous neuroscience expert who works with brains. And in putting them in conversation, you start realizing that like uh, Jeffrey says, well, this we are biologically inspired, so neural network works like neural networks in the brains do. But when a brain scientist who like slices open the brains and sees things is like, but that's not what is happening here. There is this brief move back that happens often from the sciences, or in this case, it's actually not even the sciences, right? It's between computer science and neuroscience. There's this move that happens like, yes, but I'm not talking about biology. I'm like just biologically inspired. Like I'm talking about just the fundamental features. I'm not talking about specifics. Just talking about the fundamental features. So this back step, the back step into fundamental research and back step into, but no, like, yeah, sure, that's not how memory works, but like, by and large, right? Is what allows the two people to continue using the same term without actually ever needing to talk. And I think that's what I'm trying to. So, which is say, I'm just extending what you're saying is that there's this, yeah, like sciences and the humanities. But even if you take sciences themselves, there are going to be these gaps and differences, and that are worth kind of like thinking and pondering over because they let us know whether like maybe the computer science definition of something is better for an architect to use than say the neuroscience one, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe like that is more helpful. But in trying to flatten it, we sort of like let go of opportunities and potentials and possibilities that may already be existing on the table, but we just didn't clock because both the terms style and style look the same. I can't hear you again, Ishan.
Can you hear
Nope,
me now?
still
Yeah,
not.
sorry. Yeah.
Yes, now I can hear you.
There's a whole system over here where I have to switch off the mic so that you're on Twitch, we can't hear your echo. So that's why I keep switching the mic off. Is yeah. So I had a couple of questions. While there are other people who might you do. Well, okay, why don't you come on, Robbie? Just come. There's another question from the students.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate the way you've unpacked, I think, the way that we historically understood style and the way that artificial intelligence, the introduction, has started to sort of split that narrative. I'm wondering, and it sounds like some of your work already has begun to speculate on other terms or other sort of phenomena that have been introduced by similar technologies start to enact similar things. I'm curious if you could speculate on perhaps like what some of those relevant terms are. And also linguistically, I think you've started to talk about the gap that develops, but I'm curious if there's, you think maybe like opportunity for like a sort of mutual learning, like if the scientists can start to learn from the technology and the way that terminology is executed, or if sort of collectively, linguistically, there might be a readjusting or moving of a point of the way that we use words to describe different phenomena.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think, yeah, your sense is right, that you can see the whole field wide with several different terms that demonstrate these distinctions. But your sense is also right that I think what's vital there is trying to understand the ways in which convergences happen, or can happen, right? So I was at a talk yesterday at NYU, and one of the things that we ended up discussing between the panelists um, was actually about how there are several like linguistic principles about language construction and translations between languages and so on and so forth, that were outlined very like paradigmatically in 50s, 60s, 70s, and then formed the basis actually of a lot of computational linguistics as well. Uh, you know, it always comes as a shock to people, but like uh, Noam Chomsky is the only person who is often like read in linguistics and computer science definitionally, and by Epstein apparently. But my point there is that there are all these like distinctions that we have, um, and what then the sort of what we have today, what that helps us do is like actually go back and test, like test synthesis and principles that we just thought were like untestable, right? So there's some really recently great work in cross-lingual models, figuring out where languages actually, despite not having the same sort of uh, linguistic roots at all, like I don't know, like if you take like Latin and Korean, uh, like if Latin and Korean show certain sort of overlaps, despite being from different language families, um, and or like if the way that words develop in Latin and Korean show some overlaps, uh, you would be able to like sort of say yes or no to a lot of like fundamental knowledge in languages. Now, with AI, you actually can do that because cross-language models are a thing. And so in this particular case, it's actually the fact that you have this convergence and not just a divergence that allows you for the possibilities of like testing things out, or like being more creative with your research, because there are these like small scale things, but there are also these like sort of interesting hybrids that will be formed. So if X means style for AI and Y is what it's meant for by a human, then I think there's like these gonna be hybrids that will eventually form. Like either our understanding will change, or we will find something else to be style, and so on and so forth. And I think it's in those moments where you like bring them, and there's friction, and there's disagreements, and there's testings, and there's speculation and experiments, that the most sort of like the most interesting stuff lies.
Yeah, sorry, you missed him saying thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
Um, I have we've been, I think both the questions that have come up right now have been sort of about the crossovers between the languages of different professions, or different spaces that are studying the same issues. And in that sense, I'm interested now to like talk about style more specifically within the creative fields, and the distinction between style, aesthetic, and filters, because I think they're kind of categorizations. But one question is it worth studying them as different things? Two is it worth studying them as AI understands these things differently versus we understand them differently? And are there again crossovers between all three of them? Because I think that there might be in the way you spoke
Yeah.
about codes, but clearly there's a difference that is important, and they're used also culturally in very different scenarios. So yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on these three words: style, aesthetic, and filters.
Yeah. Okay, so here's my initial attempt at that. I think that's actually a really great question. Um, my initial attempt would be to say style and aesthetics, both of these terms have a much broader gap between the sort of creative and cultural domains and technical domains. Whereas filter, there's much less gap. I actually do think in most cases, the technical definition of filter will work really well with sort of like definitions of filtering. So there is like a whole sort of creative and historical and aesthetic sort of like work around filtering as well. And I think actually their definitions probably come closer. Um, and then if I'm thinking about these terms, for most practical purposes, filters in early 2010s were later rebranded as styles, right? So actually filtering was a middle step between textures and styles. And so for visual culture, and that's where you see like the utility going down, because like you can't call I put a Charles Dickens filter over my story, right? But you can say I put a Van Gogh filter on my image. And so style then comes in as like an even more abstract category that can subsume both filters and sentence structure, which is what it is for Dickens or Hemingway or whatever, right? Um, and so, which is to say, style and filter much more closer for some categories than aesthetics. Um, and the reason for that is that actually it's quite idiosyncratic. The way that we understand aesthetic today and the way that we use the word aesthetic in popular discourse um does become sort of like this, uh, what's it called? Yeah, it does. It doesn't look anything like how aesthetic is understood, either historically or by other domains. I mean, in fact, when students started using the word aesthetics, or like I don't know, like X is an aesthetic, right? Like dark academia is an aesthetic, or X or Y or mood boards, things like that. Yeah, what was happening here was like curation. What was happening here was clustering. What was happening here was, in some cases, identification of common themes, but not necessarily that as the overwhelming force. Um, Aesthetic for the arts and the humanities is like a category of judgment, right? So you go back to Kant and this and that. Whereas aesthetic is a slightly more objective seeming term for popular discourse. Again, actually, in some cases, pretty close to what style is. Um, so what I'm trying to say is that I think, yeah, these terms all kind of collapse together, but not all at the same time. So style in 2014 would not have collapsed onto filters, but it did after that. And aesthetic would not be collapsing onto it, but it did at some other point of time. Today, I can see that actually of all these three, if I were to sort of, make a bet, I would say, well, someone who's an expert in style, historically, philosophically, conceptually, might actually find filter to be the closest of the three that we are talking about when they look at a technical thing. It's like, what have you identified? Have you identified an aesthetic, a style, or a filter? Well, in most cases, you identified a filter, I would say, especially for visual arts. For linguistic arts or sonic production, which actually produces a whole thing, like music production with AI has its own, I think, like sort of interesting history. It comes from signal processing and all that, but that would be a different category to understand. Yeah, that's my initial thought.
Yeah, I mean that's because I've been thinking more specifically about how who gets to create a style and who gets to create an aesthetic, right? And I think when I think you spoke about, which is fascinating, this idea like that the style, the death of style essentially was in postmodernism, or that's when style stopped becoming what it was, and I almost see that also as the rise of aesthetic around that time, right? And especially with the internet, we see aesthetics becoming more, having more access, or you have in general public have more
Yeah.
agency in deciding aesthetics. And now
Mhm.
aesthetics then also, maybe unlike how style was understood, and let's specifically talk about visual culture. How style might have been understood was these codes, as you spoke about, of how something looks, and but then aesthetic goes almost beyond it connects different different mediums of style together. So an aesthetic might even start to connect environmental systems, the way you feel in a place, the sounds with visuals. Like it's a combination of all these medias together, and it reminds me a little bit about how you said, like, well, the end of style was actually because of the fact that we sort of now have all styles available to us, and they can be recombined and remixed. I don't know if this is making sense, but I'm myself trying to connect these dots together.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways there are genealogies here that are longer than just this, but I see the contours of your point, right? So again, collage emerges in high modernism, many years before postmodernism. So the idea of recombination, repurposing, it does pre-exist, even if it sort of takes up in postmodernism. And Jameson has a whole section on remixing, including remixing of architectural styles. Um, Similarly, aesthetic as a category has never actually been bound to a single kind of cultural indication, right? So even in the very original formulation by someone like Kant, you basically see like aesthetic as being, like a beautiful aesthetic is not just about visual beauty. And he actually kind of notes that very clearly, right? So it could be uh, beauty in nature, in things that you're hearing, things that you're reading, things you're seeing, things that you're touching. And so the kind of multisensorality of aesthetics has kind of always been there. I think to me, what's distinct here is the codification of it, which is the part that kind of Jameson notes, right? And there, what you just said is making me think because, okay, so what's happening there is that in postmodernism, you start getting not just that you can like cluster all these tactilities and whatnot, but also that you can actually relate these to one another in and like make it a system of code, right? So that you can actually like replicate it easily and sort of just drag and drop aesthetics or drag and drop styles, right? Um, and so I think the AI moment for aesthetics and style is basically the natural next step for the unlinking of style from like initial moment of experience where you say that this is that. And it's also the multiplicity of linkage, which is to say that one thing can be classified as many other things. That wasn't not always necessarily true, right? Like, so in internet aesthetics, for example, you can have the same thing be a part of multiple mood boards, part of multiple aesthetics. And so this recombination that is available at en masse and is all kind of codified is what actually I think ends up giving rise to the present sort of like indeterminacy between things like style and aesthetics that are happening.
Yeah, that's really I don't know, this entire those three words have always I don't know, they've just met in so many different ways. So I'm always curious to try to unpack it, and that's really helpful to unpack those together. I want to sort of slightly, very slightly segue, but still live in the same space and talk about, your back to touching back into more conversations around AI. You've written so much about sort of computational's involvement in creative practice, and from rule-based systems, algorithms, procedural design, and so on. And so I'm curious as to how AI now, beyond questions of scale and speed, changes these, like, how does it change systems of creation? Like, if every technology brings in a different kind of style with it, let's say, or different kind of ways of making style or producing aesthetic, like, how do you see now AI changing that? Like, is it already obvious? Is this a place that we're starting to understand? Because in many ways, and I'm referring a little bit back to Remediation by Volta and Grusin, is like this idea that all new technologies are just like a repackaging of old technologies, right? So are we seeing the same thing with style? Like now with these systems, is this just a repackaging, or is it actually a different path completely? And is it again worth parsing through that to understand what is how an algorithm might express style versus how an AI might.
Yeah, I think to answer the last part, absolutely yes. I mean, I know we've discussed this briefly before, but like one of my like sort of principles for sort of researching, thinking, writing, doing something is that if I say a sentence and the word AI can be replaced by machine learning, can be replaced by neural networks, can be replaced by platforms or computation or big data or algorithms or software, then it wasn't useful enough in the first place to begin with. Like I need to start again because now I've like sort of confused my own sort of understanding of what is it that I'm talking about, what's the scale, what's the sort of precision, uh yeah, like what's um yeah, what are you talking about? Because um so to get so then to answer like the first part of it, I think that the most sort of like utility for like creative purposes beyond, as you mentioned, like intensity and scale, but that's just basically saying this is a continuation of a previous thing, and it just sort of amps it a little bit more, which firstly can itself be an important distinction, because there are times when quantitative difference makes a qualitative difference, right? Like in fact, um, uh, for several scholars, computation is nothing but writing accelerated, right? So basically, literally, like it's inscription. There is no part of any computation that isn't actually actively written somewhere, right? So everything is being right now going through our random access memories, where it is leaving a physical mark. You cannot run away from the material. So basically, computation is just trillions and gazillions of like writing things happening at the same time, but it makes a qualitative difference even if quantitatively that is indeed what's happening. It's just like where you put a write zero or where you write one is what's happening, but it at scale it does make a difference. So firstly, I think that scale itself could be the thing here that we're talking about when we talk about creativity. But even if we were to set aside questions of scale and intensity, which is often I think it's kind of like the easier answer, and I understand, like, I think that's where your question was coming from in some ways. I would say that the sort of the biggest change here is the possibility of creative links and repurposings that we just haven't had a sort of like understanding before of. So I'll give you an example to, yeah. So in 19th century, there were these projects for like gathering all of world's knowledge, right? So you see like making giant libraries, archives of like unprecedented scale. And the hypothesis always was that like no one can actually traverse these future archives that we are like right now planning for and putting money down for and making buildings for, because they're just too big for a human to like actually navigate. But that it will generate these unknown possibilities, which you by definition cannot know because it hasn't happened. And it can generate it because of uh, like the future orientation of moving between those nodes of information. Now, most of those projects didn't actually ever, get materialized because of the world wars. And in some ways, that was like, Google's inspiration for when they started like doing, we're gonna collect all of the world's information in like early 2000s. So when you look at AI that's trained on millions of images and trillions of tokens, systems of scale that sort of uh, that sort of are these like kind of hyper objects for us that we cannot wrap our head around together. Um, you essentially get into a zone where the creative possibilities lie in unknown connections that otherwise escape. Um, and I can think of like a few kinds of research groups who actually do unique things. So, okay, the elephant in the room is that the biggest issue is that there's no incentive to optimize for any of these things for any of our companies, right? Like, why do they care? Like, if you can eliminate like low level jobs and have people like produce marketing press releases by ChatGPT, it's like, why do you care whether uh a ChatGPT persona ever wins the Nobel? Like, Nobel is 1 million and my valuation is like several billion. So there's no sort of consonant like, oh, we should do this. So there's individual attempts by artists and creatives to play around with it. And as a result, because these individual attempts don't necessarily have the scalar ambition or the scalar resources, you get into the chicken or egg problem. Is like, okay, but show us what you've done. But well, actually, you can't actually do it because it takes $1 billion to like just train one iteration of a large language model from scratch. And so there are, I think, like evidently creative potentials basically coming from like outrageous linkages that haven't happened in information patterns before. But those need to be handled and practiced and experimented upon very carefully in ways that we just right now don't have the infrastructural capacity for in our world, right? Like, again, if the budget for all of arts and all of humanities research in the United States of like the last 2 decades combined cannot train a large language model once, like as an experiment, not like to make it happen, then we're just basically talking about disconsonant things that yes, there's a lot here that you can do, but um, will we do it? Unfortunately, goes back to a question of scale despite not wanting it to be.
Yeah, my hope is that these, with the abilities to start to fine tune models and train
Yeah.
smaller models might be our opportunity to start to hack these systems that have been now handed to us. And yeah, I think that's a big struggle working in around this field, is that like you're always working with a bad version of something, and then you're trying to make it into something that's exciting or worth doing for a creative practice. We're coming almost to time, so I want to just I maybe I'll ask one last quick question, and then and it's a more bigger picture question, and then I will leave you alone after that. But I wanted to know what is you've spoken so much about like, yeah, earlier in your talk was more about like a sort of history of these words. But why do you think for like even the students in the room, it's important as creatives to understand the history of technology? Like, why should we even get into it? We can just use Photoshop and app. Like, why should we understand these systems that we are trying to unpack, especially in this specific class, AI? Why is it worth our time, and why not just leave that to the technologists?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. So there's several answers to it. A simple answer is to not be a hack, which is to say that if so when we encounter something new, usually the reaction is everything's changed, or here's something like bizarrely new. And again, you've seen this happen even before AI. Like the big data moment, the platform moment was like everything, the algorithmic world, like the society of software, like everything seemed just radically brand new and different unless you start noticing patterns in the past. So either in time or in space. So you have to get out of your comfort zone to actually be able to be sure that what you found in your comfort zone was something truly interesting, or to find other interesting things, right? So you either go, outside in geography or outside in time. Those are the usual like two options. Um, so that's one. I think number two is because there is so many abandoned dead ends in history that were not necessarily dead ends. So we forget it, but everyone genuinely thought that neural networks had no future for what from during what is called the second AI winter, right? So from mid 80s to early 2000s, everyone was 100% convinced, including all funding agencies, that neural networks will never produce anything useful. So the only way that someone like a student working in 2004 would be able to come to terms with what was going to be a really interesting potential technology was by going back, because it wasn't there in the moment. And so I ask then, what is it that you're missing in the present moment, right? That you don't know, but you only get to know when you sort of like zoom out, move elsewhere, sort of disorient yourself, which is what's kind of happening here. And I think the third reason is basically, even if I was being like, very like mercenary about it, there are these like returns that happen cyclically, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. I was just looking at like all the Winter Olympic uniforms, and like everything is like referencing a 1990s look, right? So I mean, the cycles get smaller for these like returns of like aesthetic and of returns of like preferences. But again, you don't know that until you know what was cool, right? Like now, if you like, I don't know, go to a thrift store and like, wow, we really forgot how to make like table lamps. Like these are so cool. Only then will like, IKEA produce the $20 version of it next year, because now they're like, well, everyone's really interested in 1960s style for some reason. But you don't actually know that even for technical or for creative stuff until you start traversing those, because things get ossified into codes and it looks like a complete system. A code always looks like all the ends of it. And so you have to switch codes and have to go elsewhere to see new things and see new possibilities, creatively speaking.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for that that great conversation, and yeah, I like this was the unpacking of all the sort of style, the words, the different communities involved in producing AI was yeah, it's just going to be really something that we're going to be talking about right after this conversation. So I'm not going to keep you up anymore. I know this is you're hitting the level, the reaches of your jet lag at this point. So I'm sure we're going to have many other conversations in the future. So thanks again for joining us, Ranjodh, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. And to everyone in the room, I'm always just an email away, and I really look forward to actually continuing the conversation, Zishan. I'm yeah, really, really grateful. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye. See you.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.